Hi BookTube, it's Roz and I'm here with a tag. First one I've done for ages, and I've got a great long queue of tags that I should have done, and people have kindly tagged me in. And instead I'm going to do one that I've literally been tagged in this week. How perverse is that? But I guess it just kind of caught my enthusiasm, and here I am on holiday, so I can't do one of those tags that involves actually sort of pulling books off your shelf and so on. It's all had to come out of my head. So here we go. This is the Western Canon book tag, and it was created by Aaron Facer, and I was tagged by Jim at Books, Reading and Stuff. It's a really clever tag that doesn't have lots of prompts, but is one to really get you thinking, okay? And the prompts are, okay, if you were to choose 20 books to represent your reading of the sort of canon of Western literature, how would you choose? What would you look for? Once you picked your 20, what sort of blind spots or gaps do you notice? Oh, gorgeous, isn't it? First thing to say is this is a completely impossible task. 20 books, the entire, history of Western literature, let alone all the rest of the world. I mean, where do you start? So I set myself some parameters in terms of how I would choose. And parameter number one was that I, perhaps arbitrarily, but nevertheless, I decided that I wouldn't pick anything that was published less than 100 years ago, because, how do we know something is part of the Western canon? A sort of, I don't know, it's an odd concept, isn't it? But some idea of kind of literature that is stood the test of time, I suppose. Well, if it hasn't lasted 100 years yet, then it hasn't stood the test of time as far as I'm concerned. Okay. Second thing is I thought I've got to narrow this down to not exactly fiction, but to stories. I'm leaving out all of non-fiction, no essays, no history, no philosophy, we're not going to get Plato or whatever, left all of that out. And no religious texts in the sense of things like the Bible, nothing that's like the religious text of a faith, things that have religious themes. So that kind of leaves me with epics and epic poems, long poems, sagas, and then plays and novels. Once novels start to feature in literary history. So that's how I've sort of restricted it a bit to make it a slightly less impossible task. It's still impossible. And that's where we come to, blind spots and gaps. So I've picked 20. Or the other thing is, obviously, they have to be things that I've read and appreciated. Not necessarily like my favourite books, but yeah, things that I have read. And in fact, then why, if I've not picked my favourite 20 books, what was my other criteria for choosing? I'd say the other criteria was, I suppose I was trying to pick things that, I don't know, the books that subsequent writers somehow match themselves up against or respond to or are inspired by or react against. I suppose that's my concept of what the canon means, that it's the books that writers look back to as they shape what they write. That's probably not a brilliant explanation, but I hope you understand what I mean, and it'll become more obvious from the things I've chosen, perhaps. Yeah, so blind spots and gaps. Well, some of this was more about it's more frustrations than blind spots. So of the things that I've picked, all but only 3 are by women, and that is an enormous frustration to me. But because I've chosen to go, further back in time, things by women just didn't get preserved, didn't get published, didn't get, passed on. you know, I could have artificially, you know, said, oh, well, let's pick some, you know, fragments from Sappho, or, you know, I don't know, Hildegard of Bingen's, or I don't, but, you know, realistically, yeah, mostly men. Then I've taken the idea of it being the Western canon, Western literature, fairly literally. So I've said just sort of Europe, as far as sort of European Russia, and North America, basically. So, you know, that excludes most of the world, and means that basically all the books I've chosen, or works I've chosen, are written by white people, you know, which doesn't mean that there weren't things being written at these times in other parts of the world, but, you know, they're not part of the Western canon. Yeah. So, predominantly male, basically all white. What other, but what, you know, what more sort of like blind spots, I suppose? Well, one thing that's made me realise is that I basically haven't read hardly any German literature before the 20th century. That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, but, you know, yeah, just not there. I've got one in my 20. Then there's issues of space sort of create gaps. So, you know, I've definitely got a bias, I suppose, to things that were written in English. I think, let me think, out of my 20, all 7 are by British, you know, basically English authors. 1's Irish and 2's American, and so those are all, you know, originally written in English, and that is the bias of what, you know, I suppose I see as influential. I mean, like a good example is that, say, you know, I've picked Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, but if I was Italian, I'd probably have picked Boccaccio's Decameron, which I've also read, but it just felt more natural to me to pick Chaucer. So there's a sort of a bias, yeah, a blind spot of a sort there. And then there's, yeah, so an issue of space. So where am I? I could have picked any number of French novelists, you know, Stendhal or Dumas or Victor Hugo or Flaubert or whatever, but you know, it again, it was more natural to me to go to their English equivalents, as it were. So yeah, that's where you see my gaps, I think. Well, let's go for it. So, number 1, starting furthest back in time, for me, it was Homer's Odyssey. It could have been the Iliad, but the Odyssey, and I think the Odyssey has been, I enjoyed more reading it, but it's more influential, I suppose, in terms of subsequent literature. Yeah. I don't think anyone's going to argue with me over including Homer. Anyway, my second choice was, I really wanted to pick an example of from Greek tragedy. You know, the plays. You know, could have been Aeschylus, could have been Euripides. I went for Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus. Well, it was originally just called Oedipus, I think. And because, you know, that the ideas that come up in Greek tragedy kind of come up again and again in the Western canon, don't they? And, you know, Oedipus particularly, but, you know, many others. And you know, it's like, if you read a novel by Thomas Hardy, it's almost like you're seeing a Greek tragedy playing out. Yeah. So, number 3 is the Aeneid by Virgil. That's probably not going to be a surprise, as I Homer, and, you know, it seems natural to pick Virgil's Aeneid as well. But I think the thing about the Aeneid is it's like that, the first example of a deliberately written foundation story. You know, he for political purposes. It's literature in the service of politics. You know, he's writing about the foundation of Rome and giving it this sort of history. It's also just got great stories and sort of the ruined love affairs, and anyway, I could go on and on. I've got to go faster, haven't I? Number 4 Ovid's Metamorphoses. Now, I haven't given dates of this, but this is, obviously Homer was back in the 8th century BCE, and Sophocles' Oedipus, we actually know the date when it was first performed. It was 429 BCE. The Aeneid was 19 BCE. So Ovid, we're finally getting into, the modern era, as it were, 8 AD. There you go. And those stories that you get in Metamorphoses just come up again and again. They're picked on, by Shakespeare or by Chaucer or by, just so many people draw on those, and they're almost like the idea of the short story. Many short story writers, I suppose, kind of come from there. Like, if you think of Borges, say, you can see Ovid's influence on him. Number 5, is slightly left field, I suppose, and that's I've picked the Saga of the Volsungs. I could have picked another Norse saga. That's from around 1270, but it's always a bit unclear with the Icelandic and Norse sagas. And in a way, that's there. I could have picked Beowulf. I could have picked a version, Crescent of Troyes, a version of sort of Arthurian legends or what Arthur, but it's almost standing in for those North European sort of stories that come back round in so many times in all the way to Sir Tolkien and beyond, and reappear, the stories of knights and chivalry, but also kind of fantasy. That's why that's there. Next one is one that I'm sure no one's going to argue with, and that's Dante's Divine Comedy, 1320. Almost, in a way, the first kind of consciously written fantasy novel. It was religious, he was, but he's sort of creating a world. He's set out just from his head, not drawing on old stories or oral history, or obviously he draws a bit on the Bible and so on, but not, it's like it's really all from his imagination. Next for me, number 7, I've gone for Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, and 1392. Bawdy, using his own language, not, Dante was the same, he chose to write in Italian, that thing of not harking back to, writing in Latin, or, setting out to do something, although he's influenced by Ovid and so on, he's setting out to do something distinctive to his country, I suppose, and again, every short story writer since is sort of drawing on Chaucer, whether they know it or not, I think. Got to go a bit faster. Number 8. Well, we're leaping a bit in time here, okay, by a couple of 100 years, because I've shot forward to Shakespeare, and I've gone for, I could have picked various, but I've gone for Hamlet, 1601. There's something about Hamlet, he's the archetype of the flawed hero, the flawed protagonist, isn't he? Number 9, Cervantes, Don Quixote. That was published 1605 and 1615, the two halves. And it's often kind of cited as the first modern novel. You can argue with that, but it almost, as I say, every novel since, in a way, has in some way reacting against or inspired by Don Quixote, I think. And an illustration of that is one of the most translated works of fiction in the world. Number 10, I've gone for Milton's Paradise Lost, 1667. there's something, I don't know, so yeah. I mean, I think one could have made lots of other choices in that sort of period, as it were, but there's something about the ideas and the way he sort of takes he's meaning to write something that sort of, in a way, sort of orthodoxly religious, but actually accidentally makes Lucifer the hero. So that sort of anti-hero idea, I suppose, is one of the key things about Paradise Lost. Moving on again a bit, we skip another nearly 100 years to Lawrence Sterne and the Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. Now, Tristram Shandy is almost the first postmodern novel before the modern novels really had started. There's something, unique and brilliant about that many another novelist has fed upon. The same is true of my number 12, which is Voltaire's Candide. That sort of satire, that parody of what's gone before, again, that's, it's novel used sort of for political and philosophical purpose, but with, the sort of huge picaresque plotting enjoyment, as it were. Both Tristram Shandy and, you could have gone for Swift, you could have gone for Defoe. There's so many alternatives, but no, those for me. Okay. Coming in at number 13 is my one German choice, and that's Goethe's Faust. And that was, I was going to give a date of publication. It's a bit tricky with Faust. It's sort of 1808, but then he did another version later, but we'll go with 1808. So, and the Faust story is an old story, an old German story, and then in England we've got Marlowe's version, the play Dr. Faustus. That sort of the moral dilemma, and it's the greatest work of German literature, possibly. Yeah, so it only seems fair to put it in there when Germany is perhaps otherwise underrepresented. Then I get, finally, to introduce a woman into this list. Okay, and you can guess who it is. We're in 1813, and it's Jane Austen, and it's Pride and Prejudice. Not actually my favourite of Jane Austen's novels, but if you're looking at sort of canonical literature, I think Pride and Prejudice sort of sets the bar for the romantic novel and the novel of social observation. Yeah. Another woman comes next, and that's Charlotte Bronte with Jane Eyre in 1847. Now, why did I pick Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and not, another, not Wuthering Heights, say whatever? I think the thing about Jane Eyre that makes it, I don't know, gives it its sort of place in the canon for me is the way it's the story of someone's, I don't know, emotional life, in the sort of Bildungsroman sort of sense, but through that first person narrative that is about an individual's thoughts and feelings. Many things before, you have first person narratives before, like Tristram Shandy, for example, and you have stories that examine characters' sort of feelings before, but that combination of the two, Jane Eyre. For number 16, we make our first foray outside Europe, okay, because I've picked Melville's Moby Dick. And why? Because it feels like, and you can argue with me on this, but it feels like that every North American writer, novelist since Melville is in the back of their heads, they're sort of matching themselves up against Moby Dick. Yeah. Then, finally, we're going to have a Russian. Now, the Russians are a really good example of how, like, the lack of space in just having 20 books to choose from, really limited, What about Pushkin and Turgenev, and what about Dostoevsky, and what about Chekhov, for goodness sake? But it had to be Tolstoy. And although I love Anna Karenina best of all his works, War and Peace, it's the I don't know, the epitome of the sort of historical epic family saga sort of novel. It's got so much in there, and yeah, it definitely gets its place as one of the 20. I do get to pick one of my absolute favourite novels next, though, because I've gone for George Eliot's Middlemarch. Now, there's so many sort of big English 19th century novelists and big English 19th century novels that I could have picked. Why Middlemarch? Apart from it being my personal favourite. I think that because Virginia Woolf said that thing about it being the first novel written for grown-ups, it has that special place where other people are always sort of almost, comparing themselves or comparing other books to it. It's good, but it's no Middlemarch, Yeah. Then I thought it was perhaps not fair to not include another American book in this list. It was tempting to leave them out altogether in a way and just stay in Europe, but I have decided to include Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Why? It's that, which was date again, 1889. It's that thing of the vernacular and the sort of regionalism, and I don't know, it feels like it's sort of, not that others perhaps didn't do that in other parts in Europe perhaps, but it gave a certain twist to what a novel might be, I suppose. And then I have to get to number 20. And what do I end with? Now, I'm tipping over into the 20th century. There's, almost like your choices sort of like broaden out impossibly at this point. I wanted to pick a novel that kind of really, I don't know, represents the start of modernism, I suppose, and it could have been Proust, I would have liked it to be something by Virginia Woolf because, she's like one of my absolute favourite writers, but her best work really is after 1922, and I've set this 100 years thing, haven't I? So it has to be, ultimately, James Joyce's Ulysses, as published 1920 in sort of in bits and then gathered as a book in 1922. And, it's the ultimate modernist novel, I suppose. And again, it's like everyone since is in some way, referring to it or matching up to it. And also I couldn't resist the sort of neatness, I suppose, of starting with Odysseus in the Odyssey and ending with Ulysses. There you go. So for what it's worth, that's my 20. You can see my gaps, I think, and you see what I mean. But equally, the impossible constraints of picking 20. Who am I going to tag? I'm going to tag Britta Bola, because I'm hoping she'll bring a more European sensibility to this and, make me feel embarrassed at all the, the authors that from the rest of the European tradition, at least, that I've missed out. I'm going to pick Elizabeth of Bouquins and Books because she's a French speaker, so I'm hoping, she's probably going to have a different sort of experience of literature, a different set of influences. And then I'm going to pick two other women that I think are just really well read, something to do with them being librarians, perhaps. One is Lindy of Magpie Reads, and the other is Shelley Swearingen. Oh, can't speak this evening, it seems. But if anyone else fancies doing it, go ahead.